Welcome to all of you who brave the cold, and those of you from home watching who bought the pay-per-view package. It's nice to have you here today. For those of you watching at home and who decided not to come today because it was minus 10, it has warmed up to a balmy minus 6. So there you go. All right. Well, let's go ahead and open in a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we're thankful to be here today and grateful for the people here dedicated to make this happen, make this service happen, the classes, everything that goes into something like this that we take for granted. And I just pray for a blessing on all of us as we brave these temperatures. I pray for safety on the roads, safety with anything that might fall, and safety from the cold itself. And I just pray that you would bless our time today in this class, in our small groups, and that this just be a wonderful day of fellowship and learning more about you and your word. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, your handouts mentioned at the bottom there. I like to do this on occasion, some reading recommendations. So I have an article that I really like. You can find this online. I brought my copy here. It's about 30 pages. It's a nice summary of the period. And then this book called Bridging the Testaments. It just came out in November. I was very excited about this because I was going to name this class Bridging the Testaments, and then the scholar comes out with a book with the same name, and I'm like, well, got to think of something else. And then I did this, and there's a book called From Malachi to Matthew, so I'm like, forget it, I'll stick with this. So I got the book, and it's quite a deep dive on the subject. But I have a copy of it here if you all want to look at it, or if you need to exercise. So, couple of things though. I always like to do this at the beginning of the class. As you know, the Babylon Bee satire alert. Since I'm going to be mentioning Daniel today, I thought it was only appropriate to use this one. Archaeologists discover the prophet Daniel's weight loss diary. That might make more sense later on, or it just might not be funny right now. And the trivia question. Here's what I like to do. I have a trivia question, multiple choice, and I'm going to try to figure out who answers it correctly first, because the winner, if you want, has one of these. Yeah. That's usually a safe answer, isn't it? Okay. Bible scholars believe that Daniel was roughly how old when he was cast into the lion's den?
30.
Who said 80? You got it.
Wow.
80 years old. Oh. Yep. Tim. Mr. Wilson. Yes, Mr. Wilson. Yep. 80 years old. So, wouldn't have been much of a challenge for the Lions if God wasn't there with them, that's for sure. Okay, I want to briefly go over the Old Testament. What we're trying to do here is build a nice foundation for when we get to the intertestamental period and finding out as we go from Malachi to Matthew what kind of a scene we are leaving when we close the books on the Old Testament. So last week I ended by talking about the split that happened after Solomon died and his not very bright son took over and said, you thought my dad was bad, just wait. And so there was a split of the nation into two distinct kingdoms. There was the nation of Israel, which had 10 of the 12 tribes, and this red area here was Judah, which contained the other two, and that was situated in Jerusalem. I talked about the top half, or the top kingdom last week. I'll just go over this again very briefly. The one that styled themselves as Israel had capitals at Shechem, Tirzah, and then later Samaria, which will be important later on when we talk about the Samaritans. And those are the 10 tribes that were involved in that kingdom. Their holiest place was called Mount Gerizim, and there's a picture of it there. And, the Old Testament law said you had to do a lot of the sacrifices, a lot of the holidays, a lot of that, all of that at the temple in Jerusalem. Well, these guys went rogue and built a temple on Mount Gerizim and built other temples with idols in them, and pretty much required, the kings did, that all of the people go to these places instead of Jerusalem. They wanted to keep everybody in this new kingdom of theirs. And so, that was one violation of the law and one of many that would follow. There are some notable kings that you've heard of. Ahab, he did one who did not marry very well. Jezebel's husband, and Jehu. I had this color-coded chart, and they were a certain color if they followed God, and another color if they didn't. And none of these Israeli kings had the good color on them. It was all pretty much evil. The prophets involved here, who kept themselves very busy, as you can imagine. Elijah, Elisha, Jonah, Amos, and Hosea. This kingdom lasted for about 200 years. There was a war. They were constantly at war with Judah, the nation that they just split off from. And in 722 BC, they were invaded, conquered by the Assyrians. Now, Judah was spared the wrath of the Assyrians, but they were still pretty much paying tribute to them. We will let you live as long as you give us a payment. So, but as far as the Israelis were concerned, they took the best and brightest and hauled them back over to their capital, which was Nineveh. But this is what remained. All this yellow was what the Assyrians took over, and this little tiny red space here is what was Judah for the next 100 or so years. So the Assyrians were the ones who were in control at this point in time. I'll go over this very briefly, but this was how vast of an empire they were. If there was a Mount Rushmore for brutal, nasty empires, the Assyrians would be on that Mount Rushmore. All sorts of atrocities, barbaric activities that they did. I don't even know if barbarians would read about the Assyrians and go, I think you went a little too far there. I mean, that's kind of how nasty they were. Jeff?
One of the books of the Bible talks about being led out with a hook, and they actually showed engravings on these friezes that had hooks in people's mouths.
Hooks in the mouths and noses and all that. Yes, they were.
That's not nose piercing or ear piercing.
No, not of the voluntary variety anyway. So this is how far the Assyrian Empire stretched. Nineveh is up here along the Tigris River in modern-day Iraq. I think there were a lot of Assyrian ruins and archaeological finds that ISIS destroyed a few years back. These are the names of some of the kings. I won't go into these in any great detail, but you've probably heard of these by reading the Bible or other areas. Tiglath-Pileser, Shalmaneser, Sargon II. I'm a child of the 80s, and one of the first computer programs was a chess program named Sargon II. I don't know if there's any connection there or not, but I thought that was interesting. Sennacherib tried and failed to conquer Jerusalem. Ashurbanipal tried to invade Egypt. One king I wanted to bring up, though, was Sennacherib. He was the most famous of the Assyrian kings. He's the one that had a tussle with King Hezekiah. And back then, they didn't have, social media to brag on. They didn't have, other ways that they could really talk about their exploits. They really had to make an effort if they wanted to do that. So they would chisel things on these clay tablets. And so in Sennacherib's case, he had this, it's called the Taylor Prism, where he brags about what he did to Hezekiah. Later on, his army was defeated at the gates of Jerusalem. The Bible says, by the angel of the Lord for blasphemy, where about 185,000 perished. I apologize for the small print, but this is, a lot of these antiquities you can find in the British Museum in London, and that's a sore spot for a lot of people in the Middle East, that it's there. But this is a prism of him bragging about his military exploits. Because Hezekiah, king of Judah, wouldn't submit to my yoke, I came up against him And by force of arms and by the might of my power, I took 46 of his strong fenced cities, and of the smaller towns which were scattered about, I took and plundered a countless number. From these places I took and carried off, and he's very specific here, 200,156 persons, old and young, male and female, together with horses and mules, asses and camels, oxen and sheep, and a countless multitude. And Hezekiah himself I shut up in Jerusalem, his capital city, like a bird in a cage, building towers round the city to hem him in, and raising banks of earth against the gates so as to prevent escape. All right, so that's how the north fared, and that was a king of Judah he's talking about. The other kingdom, we'll take a look at them real quick. Judah was the southern kingdom, capital stayed in Jerusalem, 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, their holiest place, the Temple Mount. And a lot of notable kings here, a lot of them, but not all of them, did good in the sight of the Lord. Asa, Jehoshaphat, Hezekiah, one of my favorite Old Testament characters, King Josiah was one of them as well. And this was notable for the prophets that emerged before things went south for Judah. Joel, Micah, Isaiah, Zephaniah, Habakkuk, and Jeremiah, all warning the people of Judah, come back to the Lord or else, pretty much. This kingdom lasted 330 years, so considerably longer than the north, although they were always looking over their shoulder at what Assyria was going to do. And then Babylon, which had taken over everything by this point, conquered Assyria. They came and destroyed everything, including the temple, in 586 BC. And Babylon did pretty much what Assyria did. They didn't drag everybody back over to their capital, but they took the best and the brightest. They took the wisest people, the royal family, tens of thousands of people, but not all of them, back to their home turf. And this is 586 BC. This was the reach of the Babylonian Empire, which looks pretty much like what I showed you with the Assyrians. They were a little further south. Babylon is here. Nineveh was up here. But they came and took over everything. What I wanted to show you here was where the prophets, the major prophets, were located. Daniel and Ezekiel were 2 of the prophets who got dragged off in one of these. There was more than one conquering that took place, but they got dragged over to Babylon and wrote what they wrote as captives. Jeremiah stayed in Israel, and more about that circumstance later on, but he stayed there and wrote what he wrote from that perspective. All right. Any questions on that? I know I'm just kind of racing through this, but that's where things stood, and there were... Yes, Owen?
Jeremiah was eventually taken to Egypt, though.
Yes, he was.
By force. He didn't want to go there.
Right. And I'll talk about a little interaction he had with Nebuchadnezzar here in a little bit, too.
He also warned people not to go to Egypt because the famine was sort of followed them there.
Yes. Yes.
Was 586, was that like the third group taken away, or was that in the first group?
That was the third time and the last time that, because by the third time was when he had had enough, Nebuchadnezzar did, and just destroyed everything else. So Judah fell in 586 BC, and the temple was destroyed. When I talk about Nebuchadnezzar later on, I'll explain more detail on that. But, okay, the temple's destroyed. People are dragged away. And this is a faith where, it's in the book, right? You have to celebrate these occasions in the temple. You have to do your sacrifices in the temple. Not any temple, but the temple in Jerusalem, right? So, and the priest has to be involved. So when they are dragged away into this foreign land, they are a people who have no temple, they have no priest, they have no prophets, except Daniel and Ezekiel to an extent, and no king. So this was a people who really had to think of how they could compensate for the fact that all these things in their faith are no longer available to them. So this is where we get things like rabbis. Okay, we don't have a priest anymore, so maybe we still have the word, so we should focus on people who can teach the word, who aren't priests. So that's where you get the notion of rabbis. We don't have temples, but we still need a gathering place, so that's where we get synagogues. And we don't really have prophets, so what we have now are people who want to, scholars who make commentary about the scripture we do have, and that's where you get things like the Talmud and all of these other Jewish commentaries that are treated in many ways like scripture itself. So a new model of Jewish spiritual leadership in the form of sages versed in the Torah began to show up. The other major development was the notion, and here's our word for the day, diaspora, dispersion, scattering. Widespread Jewish diaspora. It would play a very important role in early Christianity. These Jewish communities that would scatter, not all of them were dragged away to Babylon or Assyria. You had some of them who fled the other way, fled to Egypt, and a lot of them stuck around in Judah and Israel. When Assyria would conquer, they would fracture all these exiled ethnic groups. Babylonians were a little kinder and would establish them in their own self-governing neighborhoods. They would let them live together as a people and keep their culture and practices. And this lasted, as we know, 70 years. And they knew it too before the 70 years were up because of Jeremiah, verses like Jeremiah 25, verses 11 and 12. This whole land will be a desolation and a horror, and these nations will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Then it will be when 70 years are completed, I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, declares the Lord, for their iniquity and the land of the Chaldeans, and I will make it an everlasting desolation. There's another passage in Jeremiah 4 chapters down the road that I'm going to read here now. I'm including it. It says pretty much the same thing, but there's a verse in here that's used a lot by a lot of Christians, and that's why I wanted to throw it in here for context. Jeremiah 29, verse 10. For thus says the Lord, when 70 years have been completed for Babylon, I will visit you and fulfill my good word to you to bring you back to this place. So he's promising the people, the exiles, that after 70 years he's going to keep his promise. I've got a plan in mind. Trust me on this. And then we get verse 11. For I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for calamity, to give you a future and a hope. Then you will call upon me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you search for me with all your heart. I won't read verse 14, but you get the gist. This is a promise made to the exiled people of Judah, and it has been, co-opted, used for other purposes. I have a strong temptation to just, take this class in a whole other direction, but I will power on, because I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Just kidding. That's just an example of what I'm talking about. All right. So let's look at these communities in exile real quickly. You have the Jews who were taken off to Babylon, the royal family, the best and brightest, the Daniels and the Ezekiels and Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and all those. A lot of the Jews that were taken captive stayed there when it was time to go back after those 70 years. And a lot of them did so by choice. Some of these people became high-ranking government officials. Daniel, Mordecai, Nehemiah, although Nehemiah was one that came back. Some of the other things that happened in this community, Aramaic began to replace Hebrew. Aramaic was a language used in that region. And, the Babylonian Talmud is very strong among the Jewish faith today. It wasn't really started until 500 AD, but a lot of the Jewish faith is centered around these Babylonian influences by descendants of people who stuck around and didn't go back. And another thing we have to remember is that the Babylonians and the Persians, they're not children of Abraham, but they are children of Noah, and they are children of Adam. And so what we find here in Babylon and Persia are their own creation stories. In Babylon, it was called the Enuma Elish. And they also have their own story of what happened with the flood called the Epic of Gilgamesh. And, these are people who, during Noah's time after the flood, their sons, there was a diaspora there too. The sons, spread out and populated different parts of the earth, and in a lot of cases didn't stay true to the God of their forefathers, and you had different parts of the culture over time seep into these creation and flood narratives. But I just found it fascinating to know that there are other cultures and civilizations out there who have a notion of there being a creator, a creation, and a flood. Any of you ever read the Epic of Gilgamesh? A couple of you who have? Yeah. A lot different from Noah and the Ark. It's a good God, evil God, fight things out. Gilgamesh is not one of those two, but it's kind of observer of sorts. There was another Jewish community who, trouble coming from the east, let's take off west. Let's not stick around and find out what's going to happen. Let's just, like brave Sir Robin, bravely run away. Just go to the opposite direction of where the trouble is. So many Jews fled to Egypt during the Babylonian invasion, and they settled in one of two places. They settled up in Alexandria, which is where Joseph and Mary went to. I guess I don't know how ironclad that is, but that's would pretty much have to go there. Or on an island down the Nile called the Elephantine, where they became mercenaries. Now, the group that moved here, they kept the Passover and they performed sacrifices, but when they mixed that up with Egyptian culture, they started throwing in worship of other gods, and that angered both the Egyptians and Jerusalem, the priesthood back home. It's kind of impressive if you can anger both people. You're trying to please both, and you wind up angering both of them. But there had been a very prominent community of Egyptian Jews for millennia. Then we get to the 20th century. In 1956, I know most of you don't remember this at all, but in 1956, there was a little scuffle about the Suez Canal, and then you had the Six-Day War in the 60s, and in the 70s you had the Yom Kippur War, and Egypt and Israel going at each other's throats. Egypt decides, we're done with having Jews here, we're going to kick you all out. So the Jewish community in Egypt went from hundreds of thousands, and it dwindled rapidly. Would anyone happen to guess the current number of Egyptian Jews? I'm not talking about the Israeli ambassador in the embassy. I'm talking about Egyptian Jews. 1,200? Low hundreds. 3. 3 old ladies. 3 old ladies are the last 3 Jews living in Egypt. They were not forced out with everyone else. The property wasn't confiscated. They were allowed to stick around. Their families, their synagogue was allowed to stick around, and all but 3 of them have now died off. And this started in the mid-1950s. So just thought that was fascinating that it's down to 3. They are trying to rebuild or repair the synagogues that were there. Tim, do you have a question?
No, I was going to make a comment. Going back to Babylon.
Mm-hmm.
Current day, if you really want to irritate an Iranian, point out to them that the vast majority of Jews settled in the land probably has a Jewish ancestor.
Yeah, that would do it. I think I aggravate him just by existing, some degree. But yeah, you're right. That would be a quick way to do it. Nebuchadnezzar, he's the only king I'm really going to profile here. He's certainly the most prominent. His name means, "O God, Nebu, defend my firstborn son." Besieged Jerusalem because the kings of Judah allied with his enemies. He's trying to take over. I'm trying to take over, and you guys are not being helpful, so I'm just going to have to take care of you too, I guess. And, did so, deported thousands of people, and came back and did it for a second time, another time in 586 BC, the third time, I think. Third time. And he said, third time's going to be the charm for me. I don't want to mess with you guys anymore, so I'm destroying the temple and the city, and that was that. Jeremiah 39. Now Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, gave orders about Jeremiah. See, Jeremiah was the prophet who's warning Judah about this. You guys better stop, or else Babylon is going to make us suffer. And he was right. And you know that proverb, no good deed goes unpunished? They were aggravated with Jeremiah and threw him in jail because he wouldn't shut up about the prophecy. So Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, gave orders about Jeremiah through Nebuzaradan, the captain of the bodyguard, saying, "Take him and look after him, and do nothing harmful to him, but rather deal with him just as he tells you." So Nebuchadnezzar himself showing a little mercy to Jeremiah. This is a passage from the history of Al-Tabari. This was a Babylonian history. Sounds like a reporter. "We received word that he found the prophet Jeremiah in the Israelite prison. God had sent him as a prophet to warn the children of Israel of what Nebuchadnezzar was to bring upon them, and to tell them that unless they repented and gave up their evil deeds, God would visit upon them the power that would slay their fighting men and capture their children. Nebuchadnezzar said to Jeremiah, 'What is it you want?' Jeremiah then told him that God had sent him to warn the Israelites of what was to befall them, but they did not believe it and imprisoned him. Nebuchadnezzar said, 'Wretched people, they defied their Lord's messenger.' He released Jeremiah and treated him well." Couple of images here. This was Saddam Hussein trying to style himself as a modern-day Nebuchadnezzar. This was a mural that was very prominent in Baghdad during his time. And we have, of course, the other king, one of the last kings of Babylon, a co-regent, Belshazzar, yes, and the writing on the wall was another Babylonian king before they were taken over by the Persians. Putting the prophets in their place. I have that handout on the back for you to put this all in context here. Does anyone know the difference between a major and a minor prophet? I always thought that was an insult. Calling someone a minor prophet. That wouldn't be very flattering to it.
It's the content they wrote.
Content they wrote. The size of the book. It really was one of the big factors. That, if it's a small book, you're a minor prophet. A larger book, you're a major prophet. Daniel only had 12 chapters, and Zechariah and what was the other one? Hosea, I think, had 14. But Daniel's chapters were a lot wordier, so he gets the appellation of being a major prophet, which I found interesting. If Zechariah would have just written a few more words, we could have promoted him to being a major prophet, right? So the Assyrians were replaced by the Babylonians, replaced by the Persians. Now, these are the ones we're going to be spending the rest of our Old Testament time in, and look at this map here. Persia is in modern day what? Okay. Persia is in modern day Iran. So it's important to note the Iranian people are not Arabs, they are Persians. And they speak Farsi and not Arabic. That's another way you can anger them, is to refer to them as Arabs, right? Say that and think that Arab, Persian, it's all the same. It's not so. So the Persians become the ones in charge, take over Babylon, and we get steadily more merciful as we go along. So the Persian king, the first king's name was Cyrus, believed that the best way to keep these people loyal is to give them a little bit more freedom and let them govern their home territories in my name. And that was a very successful policy that he had. So he wins over the Babylonian Empire and all of these Jewish exiles, and then not just them but other exiled nations, he allows them to go home in stages and set up their provinces in ways that would remain loyal to him. So the first phase happens in 538 BC. Zerubbabel was the descendant of King David. I think he was referred to as a prince. So the Persian King Cyrus allowed Zerubbabel to lead a group back to the homeland, and he was given leadership of it. 50,000 returned and rebuilt the temple, but it took them a while to do it. They got back home, and it was quite a struggle, which I'll get into in a moment, for all the struggles that they endured. You can read about this in Ezra and Nehemiah. And let's see, it was about 16 years later that the Persian king, Darius I, said, that temple's not finished yet. Well, here's some royal money. Take this back with you and finish the construction. And it was completed in about 516 or 515 BC. So then, fast forward a few years, 458 BC, another 58 years, and the temple's there, but the people are not really following the law. They don't really know what to do. So they send another group back home with Ezra, the scribe, returns to Jerusalem with a small group of Israelites and restored the law and the ritual. So prophets like Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi were encouraging the finishing of the temple and the return to the law. A lot of people look over these minor prophets because it seems, if you don't study them, you'd think, well, it's just doom and gloom for all these pages and there's nothing interesting. Let's just get to the New Testament. And that's not so. There's a lot of fascinating stuff in there about Haggai encouraging the restoration of the temple so that the world might be blessed. Zechariah, the coming of God's kingdom will be preceded by rebuilding the temple. That's why this is such an important thing to do. Malachi, be prepared for the messenger to come. A lot of verses in Malachi referencing John the Baptist. So Ezra goes back and reinstitutes the law. I know I'm zipping through this, so I'll go back to it in a minute. And then phase 3, okay, we have this temple, we have the law, but no city is really a safe city unless you have walls. So Nehemiah, another 13 years later, he came to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls and become its governor. I'll talk about the resistance in a little bit, but we now once again have a Jewish state in Judea again, but it's under the Persians. The kings, which I want to mention here. Cyrus the Great. I always like to joke that if it's someone named the Great, it's a name they gave themselves, and it's not, came naturally, but he really was. He was a fascinating king. Conquered the Medes and the Babylonians, issued an edict of letting them return, tolerant of the customs of local people, and left their own people in charge. Mentioned in Daniel, he's mentioned in 2 Chronicles, and he's mentioned in Isaiah 44 and 45, which was written about 150 years before he was born. Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, goes so far as to name him 150 years before he's born. Cyrus is the one who's going to deliver. So nobody probably even heard of Persians when Isaiah was writing that, so it was pretty impressive, but not surprising. This was foretold, this is Josephus, foretold by Isaiah 140 years before the temple was demolished. Accordingly, when Cyrus read this and it admired the divine power, an earnest desire and ambition seized upon him to fulfill what was so written. So he called for the most eminent Jews that were in Babylon and said to them that he gave them leave to go back to their own country and to rebuild their city Jerusalem and the temple of God, etc., etc. So according to Josephus, Cyrus reads about this prophecy with his name that's 150 years old, and he's thinking to himself, well, I got to do this now. I mean, the guy mentioned me 150 years ago, right? So sure, go on and do this. But he was this way with all nations, not just the Jews. This I wouldn't like to be a writer back then. It'd be a lot of work, chiseling the stuff on things. This is the Cyrus cylinder in the British Museum. I want to read this in my best Titanic voice. I am Cyrus, king of the world. From as far as the settlements on the other side of the Tigris, where their temples have long lain in ruin, I returned the gods who lived therein to their places and provided them with permanent temples. I gathered all their inhabitants and returned them to their homes. Daily may all the gods whom I have brought back to their holy sites speak on my behalf for a long life and plead my favor before, Bel and Nebo. All right. Other kings here, I'm running out of time, I'll just race through these. Cambyses, you don't hear about him very much. He's not in the Bible. 2 reasons. 1, his reign was short, and B, he spent that short reign focusing on Egypt. So he's not really a factor in what's going on with the people returning to Israel. He conquered Egypt, claimed to be the son of their sun god. He died in Egypt under mysterious circumstances, and according to legend, this was going to be my dig it for the week, but I picked something else. He lost an army of 50,000 people in an Egyptian sandstorm. These 2 Italian archaeologists supposedly founded this army in 2009. So there's no disputing that this is Cambyses' army, but the scholars who are refuting what the Italian conclusions were say that they were attacked, they were ambushed by Egyptians, and it wasn't a sandstorm, but it's a pretty impressive find after these thousands of years that they were able to discover that. Darius, I don't know if it's Darius or Darius, I prefer Darius. Darius I, he's not Darius the Mede, but he was an important governor in terms of organization. He's mentioned in Ezra. Here's the reason I bring him up. Before the Romans did their roads, he facilitated communications and travel by building royal roads and a system of roads eastward. So the gospel was able to travel eastward through the Apostle Thomas and other people thanks to the roads that Darius built. So Darius built these roads. Communication was faster, more efficient, and the Greek historian Herodotus, I would write that name down. He wrote a lot of fascinating first-hand accounts of history, had this to say about the people who carried messages along his roads. These neither snow nor rain nor heat nor darkness of night prevents from accomplishing each one the task proposed to him with the very utmost speed. Does that sound familiar? So, yeah. Although if Herodotus were writing today, he'd say, it's junk mail, they can wait a few days to get it, It's too cold out there, don't mess with it. But that's where we get that from. Xerxes, you know this guy by his wife, Esther. Feast of Purim established under him. He's the one that first started fighting the Greeks and lived to regret it. He was assassinated by a captain of his bodyguard. And then Artaxerxes was the one who was in charge when Nehemiah was sent to rebuild the wall. The Old Testament canon, according to Josephus, was complete during his reign. Now, this is the big point I wanted to get about Persian influence, because the Persians under Cyrus had their own religion called Zoroastrianism, symbolized by this man bird with these huge wings. If you see a lot of the ruins in Iran, you will see this symbol. Or you could just go to the British Museum, I guess, because it's all going to be there. But you'll see a lot of these symbols on ancient Persian ruins and reliefs. This was a religion that was dualistic, good God fighting evil God. It had a huge impact on the exiled Jewish community. Here's some of the things that the Zoroastrians taught. There's a single supreme being, Ahura Mazda. There's good and evil, cosmic battle between two deities. The end times, hell. Their priests were called Magi. And they also, this also impacted the Babylonian Talmud. It's these commentaries that started talking about angels, male and female demons, talismans, reward, punishment after death, interpreting dreams. So you have a Jewish people who are away from their temple, away from the law, away from knowledge of their holy books to an extent. And this goes on for generations and generations. They become more Persian than Jewish in some regard. Persian culture seeps in. Some of this theology seeps in. And you remember that slide I had last week of things that were in the New Testament that were not in the Old Testament? Afterlife, judgment, hell, resurrection of the dead. These are all elements of the Persian religion that became a part of some Jewish people's religions during their time in exile. So when the Jewish people are sent back, there is a huge clash with the people who were still there. There were the Samaritans who were living there, and remember, the Samaritans already were not following God's law by making their own holy places and doing their own practices. Foreigners had moved in and started intermarrying with Samaritans and having their own culture. And now you have these upstarts who've been gone for 70 years start coming back, saying, hey, we like what you've done with the place, now get out, right? And so the Samaritans, as you read in Ezra and Nehemiah, fought them every step of the way in trying to rebuild the temple, fought them in trying to reinstitute the law, fought them trying to rebuild the wall. They had their own center of worship and their own practices. They claimed to be true Israel, but they had impure bloodlines. And so, the people returning thought, you guys have messed things up. This is our home. It's been 70 years, but yes, we are back, and the Persian king favors us, so run along. And the Samaritans and the other people are saying, well, we're here now. Possession is whatever tense of the law. And it's not like you guys are exactly on the right track either. You're bringing in all this stuff, resurrection of the dead, and that we've never heard of either. You guys are crazy. So there's a lot of conflict going on within the Jewish community that carried on and festered throughout this whole period between the Testaments. From the moment the Jews first made contact with the Iranians, they took over the typical Zoroastrian doctrine of an individual afterlife in which rewards are to be enjoyed and punishments endured. Skip down here. By the time of Christ, it was upheld by the Pharisees, whose very name some scholars have interpreted as meaning Persian. That is, the sect most open to Persian influence. So it was the Pharisees who brought resurrection of the dead and all that back to life. So, I didn't talk about Esther at all, but we're familiar with the story of how a Jewess named Esther married the Persian prince and was able to save her people from another Persian who wanted to destroy the Jewish race. So here's a modern parallel. In 2012, Iran had a president named Ahmadinejad who said in every speech, death to Israel, let's wipe them off the map. It could be about the economy or the Iranian soccer team, and he would throw in something about let's wipe Israel off the map. So in 2012, President Obama was wanting to have some sort of an arms agreement or some type of negotiation with the Iranians, and Netanyahu would go before the UN. He would go, you can't do it, you can't do it, you can't do it. So he visited the president in 2012 and gave him a gift while this debate was raging. It was a copy of the book of Esther. And the message was clear. The Iranian president was Haman, who wanted to destroy the Jewish people. Netanyahu was the Mordecai, and Obama was the king who had to figure out which side he was going to rest on. So that's just a glimpse of what the Persian influence is, with the religion especially, and all the strife it caused when the Jews were trying to reestablish themselves in Jerusalem. So here's my dig this for the week. The last Judean king who was conquered by Nebuchadnezzar was named Jehoiachin. And when he was captured, he and his family, all the princes, the whole royal family, dragged back to Babylon and thrown in jail. They were given clay ration tablets that would show what their food allocation would be for the day, how much bread, how much wine, how much oil they would get. The king, they gave him a little bit more. He had a higher ration than others. So in the 1990s, these ration tablets given to the last king of Judah were discovered near the Ishtar Gate at the ruins of Babylon. These were clay tablets written in Akkadian, which is a cuneiform, which means wedge-shaped, a lot of arrows up, down, all around. From the 6th century BC, it describes the food rations that were set aside for a royal captive identified as him. This is a picture of one of those tablets. And it said, Yaukinu, king of the land of Yehudu, is mentioned along with his 5 sons listed as royal princes. And the story of this is 2 Kings 24, verses 10 through 17. Daniel 1:5 said that this was a different king he's referring to, but the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. So there's a biblical account of this rationing that went on. I thought that was fascinating that they found a king of Judah's. I mean, I've heard about ration stamps during World War II, but ration tablets that were discovered. So thank you for hanging in there with me. Next week, we'll get into the Greeks. We are now both feet firmly planted in the intertestamental period, and we'll talk about the Greeks next time.